Hey, what's going on, folks? Welcome to Midweek Study Hall. I'm Phillip Godfrey. If it's your first time here, thank you so much for jumping on with me. If you're returning, welcome back, family. Welcome back, Bible study family. All right. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into the video today. We are continuing our study through the books of Samuel, First and Second Samuel. And today for Midweek Study Hall, we are going to be looking at Second Samuel chapters 20, well, no, Second Samuel chapter 7 through 15. All right, Second Samuel chapter 7 through 15. And for those of you that are new here, let me just give you a quick kind of statement, I guess, or update as to where we are and what we are doing. So this year we are intentionally walking through the text in a series called From Creation to Revelation. And right now we are in the book of Second Samuel, and we are going chapter by chapter throughout the entirety of the Bible this year. And right now we are meeting on Sundays at 8 p.m. So we would love to have you there. And also there's a video or maybe a live on Wednesdays as well at noon, which you are watching right now. So let's go ahead and jump in. For reference, I'm reading from the King James version. So any of the actual verse references will be there. All right, so let's start with chapter 7. And so I will also link the video here, the live from Sunday, so that you can get caught up to what happened in Second Samuel chapters 1 through 6. And so cool, let's get going. All right. So in chapter 7, what we see that it begins first by telling us that the father had given David rest all around from his enemies. And so this means that after David had exited or had completed these seasons where he had been, on the run, he had been anointed as king, he had been fleeing from Saul, he had been through war, he had defeated Goliath, he had been through all of these different seasons, that he experienced also at this point a season of peace and rest from war. David had rest from the Father from all of his enemies all around him. And during this season, or sometime shortly after this season, David is having a conversation with Nathan, who's the prophet of the time, and of this or of the time and of this area. So he's talking to Nathan the prophet, and he's sharing how he has this big beautiful home, and he loves this. He had just built a house in the city of David, and he's like, man, he has this big beautiful house, but something was bothering him, and what was bothering him is that he had this big beautiful home, but the Father, the presence of the Father, which at this time was symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, was still dwelling in a tent. It was still dwelling behind curtains, as the text says. And so David tells Nathan, like, hey, I would love to build a house for the Father, just like the house that I have, or even greater than this house, but I would love to build a house for the Father. Nathan says, like, hey, I mean, if that's something that the Father leads you to do, you should definitely do it. But later on, after this conversation, the Father speaks to Nathan and tells Nathan that this assignment to build a house for his presence, the Ark of the Covenant, is not for David. That's not David's assignment. The assignment for to build this house will actually be for his son to complete. So let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 12 through 16, and let's see this interaction. Let's see here what the father is telling Nathan about David's desire. Verse 12, and when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. So he's saying he will establish his seed's kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. So here we see that the Father is telling David, like, hey, this is a good desire that you, through Nathan the prophet, hey, this is a good desire that you have, but it's not your assignment. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it through your bloodline. I'm going to do it through one of your sons. And I want you to know that my mercy is always going to be with you. It's always going to be with your bloodline. I'm going to establish your house and your kingdom forever. And we see that this is fulfilled because David, the Messiah, comes through the lineage of the house of David. All right. And so Nathan goes and tells David all these things that the Father has spoken to him. And David is just amazed. He's overwhelmed. And he goes and sits in the presence of the Father. And he worships him. And he praises him for what he's spoken over his house. And how he has promised to establish his house forever. And he even remembers that how he had brought him from so far. How he was such a lowly person. And the Father has given him such amazing opportunity and amazing things. And there's two verses in chapter 7 that I want to pull out here, verses 25 and 26, that is a part of a prayer that I want to encourage us to pray. So let's look at that. Verse 25. And now, O Lord God, the word that thou hast spoken concerning thy servant and concerning his house, establish it forever. And do as thou hast said, and let thy name be magnified forever, saying, the Lord of hosts is the God over Israel. And let the house of thy servant David be established before thee. And this is what I encourage you to pray, you and I, all of us, to pray, add to our prayers, that Father, I pray that the word that you have spoken, the prophetic promise that you have spoken over my life, the promises through your word that you have spoken as truth over my life, that you would establish those things forever over my bloodline. And that through this process, your name would be magnified, that your name would be lifted high, and that everyone would know through what you're doing in my life, that you are the Father. You are my Father. You are the Lord of Lords. You are the King of Kings. You are Yahuwah. You are the Most High. And you would ask that you would establish our bloodline forever. All right. And so that's how I would pray that. You can pray it however you want to, but I do encourage you to add that into your prayers. All right. So let's move into chapter 8. And so in chapter 8, what we see is that David, he's going through this season of rest from chapter 7. He's having this conversation, and the Father has promised to solidify his bloodline forever. And in chapter 8, we see that David David then moves into a season where he is back in battle, but he's gaining territory. Okay, so the chapter 8 tells us about how he went to battle with the Philistines and he was victorious against them, how he won the battle against Moab and the Moabites became his servants, how he was victorious against Hadadezer and took large numbers of his soldiers from him, took large numbers of his soldiers out in war, and he was victorious against them, how he was victorious against the Syrians and of Damascus. He slayed 22,000 of those soldiers, and the Syrians became his servants as well, and how he was victorious over the Edomites, and they became his servants as well. So the text here is telling us that after this season, where he had rest all around, he had another season of war, but it was him going out and taking territory. The Father was enlarging his ability, enlarging his territory in this season. All right, and so let's look at verses 14 to 15 and see here how the Father preserved David wherever he went. All right, verse 14 of 2 Samuel chapter 8. And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom put he garrisons, is talking about David, and all they of Edom became David's servants. So all the Edomites became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. And David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment and justice unto all his people. So we see here that even though David is the one going out and fighting and being victorious in battle, what we really see is the Lord, the Father, is the one who is doing this on his behalf, who is orchestrating this entire process, especially in the spirit realm, okay? And so the Father was preserving David. And I pray that over you as well, that the Father would preserve you whithersoever he sends you, all right? And the chapter ends by telling us that David was a good leader and he led the people with judgment and justice, all right? Let's move into chapter 9. And as always, for the regulars here know this, but for those who may not be regulars, I'm just providing you a summary. We're walking through this together, but I do encourage you to go and read and study out these passages as well to ensure that I am telling you the truth first and foremost, but also to reinforce what we're doing here, and also just to know it for yourself. All right. So I'm just providing a summary, to keep us moving forward. All right. And as always, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, let me know down in the comment box. All right. So chapter 9. In chapter 9, we see David being true and keeping his word, keeping the vow that he had made actually with his beloved friend Jonathan. We talked about that on Sunday, him and Jonathan's relationship. And he did this, he kept this vow, he kept this agreement that he had made with Jonathan by intentionally seeking out whether there were descendants left remaining of the bloodline of Saul so that David could show kindness to them. David had, we saw in the previous weeks that David, on the previous studies, that David had agreed with both Saul and Jonathan to show kindness to their houses if in their absence, or in with them no longer being there, that he would make sure that his bloodline, his house, always showed kindness to their houses. And he's keeping this this agreement here we see in chapter 9. And so what David does, he asks if there's anyone of Saul's house left. There's someone, a servant from the house of Saul, whose name is Ziba. Ziba is found and brought in before David, and David inquires of him as to whether there remain any members of this bloodline. And so Ziba says yes, and David finds out through this interaction that Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, is still alive, all right? And he tells him, that Mephibosheth is lame of in his feet. We looked at that on Sunday as well, that Mephibosheth, when they were fleeing after the death of his father, his maid at the time dropped him, and he became lame in his feet. And so he just tells him that, hey, Mephibosheth is still here. He is lame, and he tells him where he can find him. So David immediately sends for Mephibosheth, and he brings him into his home, and they have a beautiful interaction. So let's look there at 2 Samuel chapter 9, verses 6 through 8. And verse 6 says this: Now when Mephibosheth, the son of David, the son of Saul, was come unto David, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold thy servant. And David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And he bowed himself and said, What is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as he was? All right. And so we see here that the decisions and the agreements that David and Jonathan had made, Jonathan, Mephibosheth's father, had made, continue to speak on his behalf. And so David here lets Mephibosheth know that he will be receiving all the land that had been allotted to Saul's bloodline, that he will now be receiving, that David will restore that unto him. And he also, then at that point, he tells Ziba, Saul's servant, he tells Ziba to go and actually work the land and till the land for Mephibosheth, and bring all the increase to Mephibosheth, but for Mephibosheth's bloodline. So now, let me say that again. David tells Ziba, all right, to till the land and then bring all the increase to Mephibosheth, but it's not for Mephibosheth. It's for Mephibosheth's descendants, because David will continually provide for Mephibosheth for the remainder of his life. Isn't this a beautiful interaction of David keeping his word to, and his vow that he made to his dear friend? Okay, let's move into chapter 10. So chapter 10 begins by telling us that David, one of David's foreign ally kings, so one of his foreign friends, had died, and his son had took reign over the nation of Ammon. All right, and his son's name is Hanun. And so David decides that he's going to send a gift to Hanun to show kindness to him, because his father had just died, and David and his father had shown kindness to one another, and David wanted to repay the gestures. So he sends a gift by some messengers to the king, And the king's, some of the king's servants and some of the king's leaders that he had around him convinced him that David's gesture was not genuine. It was not kind at all. They convinced him that what David was actually doing was sending these messengers as spies throughout the land to see what's going on, to kind of get a lay of the land, and ultimately potentially come up to war against them. So what Hanun does then, because he has these people in his ear, what he does then is takes these messengers that David has sent and he embarrasses them. The text says that he cuts off half of their beard and then cuts their clothes in half down to their buttocks. And so they're walking around half naked, half shaven, and this was a serious embarrassment for this time and this season of life. All right, and so the men go into a nearby city, and David hears what happened, and he instructs them to just stay there until their beards grow back, and then they can come home. No one will need to know or see them in their embarrassment on this journey. And so through the course of time, the Ammonites, Hanan, and I guess the people he had around him, they realize what they have done, and I believe they began to anticipate that David will attack them. So they join forces with some Syrian forces. They go out and kind of form their own little army. Well, they have an army. They go out and form an army with some allies to create a bigger army to go to war against Israel. David then sends Joab, who is one of his commanders of the army, sends Joab out to the battle. And when Joab and his brother Abishai, they get there, they split up. And so Joab says, "Hey, I'm gonna go fight the Syrians," and then Abishai says, "I'm going to go fight the Ammonites, and if one of us starts losing, the other one will come and help." But as soon as the fighting starts, the Syrians run away, and then the Ammonites see the Syrians running away, and then they run away. And so the Syrians, they eventually kind of get together a last coalition and try to make one last advance towards the children of Israel and fight against them. But they end up fleeing from David. David has now come down to the battle, and they end up fleeing from him too. But this was not before David had killed 40,000 of their horsemen and the captain of their army. And the text of chapter 10 closes by saying that all the kings that were once affiliated with the Syrians made peace with Israel, and they served Israel and never realigned themselves with the Ammonites. Because this battle here was between Hanan and really his leaders, but his leaders had given him some bad intel, and the battle was really between Hanan, the Ammonites, and Israel. It wasn't really even about it because David was being nice. The Syrians, they just kind of got roped into the middle of it, and they end up just giving themselves over to David and being their servants throughout this entire process, and kind of leaving their allyship with the Ammonites behind. All right, so let's move into chapter 11 now. All right. So chapter 11 starts by telling us in verse 1 that this was the time that it was as it was recapping. This is the time of the year when the kings go out to battle. But David is not down at the battle with his army. He is in his house. So especially throughout some of the other things we'll look at in the text, what I believe is happening, my understanding of how things operated during this time was that the army would be out fighting, but once they got towards the end of the battle, the kings would then come out, so the king could actually be the one to take the city or overcome the people, and then the king's name would then be the one associated with the victory at that location. But if the king wasn't there, then the leader of the army would be the one who was associated, the victory or the city or the region was associated with, because back then, a lot of times the region was named after who started it or who owned it or who had rights to it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so that's kind of how some of that was going on. So there was a time of year when the king left the kingly duties to specifically go down and be at battle with the army. Let's look at that in verse 1 of chapter 11. And it came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. Little sidebar. If you hear like background noise and children screaming. My children are awake. They are out here just running rampant. I'm shooting Bible study. That's what's going on. They are fine. But it is me. I just wanted to throw that out there. So we see here that this was a time where David was supposed to be out at battle, and actually his army was being successful in their battle against the children of Israel. But David was still in Jerusalem, and the text tells us that he was essentially tells us that he wasn't where he was supposed to be, and because of that, he gets himself into a little mess. So it goes on to say that he gets up from a nap. I'm presuming it was a nap because it said at the evening. He wakes up from a nap. He's walking out on his rooftop deck, and so I'm putting this summary in some of my words. Okay, they didn't say it was a rooftop deck, but he's walking out on his rooftop deck, and he sees this woman, this beautiful woman, taking a bath at her own house, which is not illegal. You can take baths inside of your house, and that's what this woman is doing. She is taking a bath in her own house, and at her own house, and David sees her because he is somewhere that he's not supposed to be. Instead of where he should have been at the time. And now he's in a mess. He sees this woman. He asks, his people, like, hey, who is this woman? They tell him that her name is Bathsheba. She is the wife of Uriah, one of the soldiers who is out at war, the place where David is supposed to be. And so he sends some servants to get the woman and bring her to him. And then they bring her into his home, and he has sex with her, and then she heads back to his house. Let's pause for a second. We've talked about this briefly, but this is something that in my opinion, this passage of scripture here also evidences the power of kings. The reality is that when there is a king, everything that the king says is what's done. And so even if these folks said, man, this isn't the right thing to do, even if Bathsheba had felt that this wasn't the right thing to do or something that she didn't desire to do, the king made a decree, the king made a statement, the king gave a command, and then everyone else had to line up with what the words the king had spoken forth, all right? And the same is true, and we have to realign our mindset to mirror this, because now we live in a kingdom as believers. We live in a kingdom with a king, the Father, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so if we do not accept or understand the fact that what the king said is now what we must do, we will find ourselves in rebellion, which the text tells us is as witchcraft. We'll find ourselves in disobedience. We'll find ourselves in situations like David, breaking commandments and just doing wicked things. We'll find ourselves as children of Belial because we are not willing or allowing ourselves to follow the instructions of the king. Does that make sense? What the king said is what the king said, and that's what the people inside the kingdom, us believers, do. Okay, let me get off that tangent. So, he's had sex with Bathsheba. He sends her home, and then shortly after that, she sends and tells him that she is pregnant. And things were already going downhill, but this is where things began to really fly downhill for sure. So David hears this, and he hatches a plan to make it seem like Uriah is the father of this child, okay? Because he knows that what he's done is wrong. So David then sends Joab a message to say, hey, send Uriah home. So he sends Uriah home, and David acts as if he cares about what's going on. He asks Uriah some questions, like how is Joab leading? How's the war going? Et cetera, et cetera. And then he tells him, like, hey, go home and just, you can head back out later or tomorrow or in a few days. Just go home and rest for a little while. But David is trying to get him to go sleep with his wife so that, again, he'll think that the baby is his. But Uriah comes and everything comes from the war, and he refuses to sleep with his wife. He refuses to go home to enjoy the comforts of his home while the rest of his friends are out at war, the place where David was already supposed to be. And so David sends him back, and David is so this part is so crazy to me. David gives him a letter and essentially sends Uriah back to the war with his own bounty on his head in his hand, his own suicide letter, essentially his murder letter in his hand. All right. And so David sends a letter to Joab, and he tells Uriah not to read it, but to give it to Joab. He sends it to Joab, and David tells Joab to sit Uriah at the war where it's the fiercest battle, and then pull back from him and let him fight that battle by himself. Um, yeah. And so Joab does as the king tells him again because he's the king, and Uriah is killed in battle. Joab sends a messenger back to David that Uriah is dead, and David and his wife, well, not David, his wife mourned him. Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, mourns him for a period of time. I believe the text says 7 days. And once that season of mourning was over, she was brought into the king's house to be his wife. But the text ends by telling us that the father was not pleased with this. Let's look at verses 26 and 27 of chapter 11, and we'll be done with chapter 11. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house. And she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. So, yeah, there were probably people who knew exactly what happened. But here also teaches us that what's done in the dark comes to the light. Even though people just thought Uriah died in battle, even though Bathsheba might have thought that her husband died in battle, the father knew the entire time what had transpired, what had gone on, and what had been done. And he wasn't pleased with it. So as we look at chapter 12, what we see is that there are consequences. The father then, declares unto David the consequences that he must endure for the decisions that he made. And he does this by speaking to Nathan and then sending Nathan, the prophet, to speak to David regarding these things. So let's look at David Nathan presents it to David through like a parable type thing. So let's read that. All right. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. And the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him and said unto him, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the one poor. So David's the rich one, and Uriah's the other one. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him, and with his children. It did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, as was unto him as a daughter. And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd, to dress for the wayfaring man that was come unto him, but took the poor man's lamb and dressed it for the man that was come to him. So basically it's saying like somebody was coming in town, and instead of the rich man using some of his cattle as an offering or to feed the guest, he takes the lamb from the poor man, the only lamb he had, and feeds it to the guest. Verse 5. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord liveth, the man that have done this thing shall surely die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. And we're going to stop there. So we see here that the father has equated what David has done as stealing from someone who has nothing when you have everything, essentially being like greedy or being like gluttonous, almost like for taking this from this person. And David is upset with hearing this story and pronounces that person should die. And while the father didn't pronounce death on David for his decisions, David repents. There was death that was required because of the decisions that David made. This is something I teach us as well because the text teaches us, is that our decisions as parents, as grandparents, as marriages and different things, whatever it be, our decisions do affect generations. And even though David made a decision and he didn't have to eat the ultimate fruit of death from it, his son still had to do it. So the generation still paid for the decisions that David made against the commandments. And for some reason, we have come to believe that because we don't see it, that these things don't exist anymore. Like that's passed away. That doesn't matter. Like nothing that you do can affect your children, and you can just make all decisions that you want. You can be disobedient to the text, and that won't ever and that won't ever affect your bloodline. That is not true. David and Bathsheba's first son did nothing deserving of death. He didn't ask to be born, didn't ask to be conceived, none of those things. But he still died because of decisions that David made. Does that make sense? We got to make the best decisions, okay? And so the father goes on through Nathan to remind David of how good he'd been to him, how he had anointed him king over Israel, saved him from Saul. Oops, I hit my mic. Giving him all things, and I got excited. Giving him all things in abundance, and he says that I would have even given you more, but because of your disobedience to the commands and killing Uriah and taking his wife, now these things will be taken from you. That your kingdom is going to be taken from you and given to another. That your wives will be taken and given to another. That someone will actually have sex with your wives out in public for everyone to see. And as I just said, the child that is born of Bathsheba will die. So David, the father's true to his word. Once the child is born, the child dies. David goes into a period of mourning. The text tells us that Bathsheba went through a period of mourning as well. And then after that, David comforted her, and she conceived again and bore a son and had a son named Solomon. All right. And the chapter 12, it ends with David going out to war with the Ammonites again. He's victorious over them, and ultimately the Ammonites now become David's servants. All right. Let's move into chapter 13. So as we begin chapter 13, I want us, as we talk through this, I want you to keep in mind that all of these things are still fruit of the decision that David made. All right, what we're going to see happen here. So chapter 13 begins by introducing us to Absalom, David's son, Tamar, David's virgin daughter, one of David's sons, one of David's virgin daughters, and Amnon, another one of David's sons. Amnon was in love with Tamar, his like half sister. So she had the same dad, different mom. So Amnon was in love with Tamar, and he was so in love with her that it was hurting him, that he was physically like in pain, that he could not be with her. He shares this with his cousin Jonadab, who is shady. Let's just put it like that, shady. He shares this with his cousin Jonadab that like he likes Amnon. I mean, he likes Tamar. He wants to be with her. All these other things, and Jonadab, gives him an idea for how he can get with Tamar. Not going and saying, "Hey, go ask her dad. Go ask your dad if you can marry her," because those types of things happened back then. No, that's not the advice that Jonadab gave him. Jonadab tells him to act like he is sick, and when David comes to check on him, tell David that he would like Tamar to come and take care of him. So he does just this, and the king obliges and sends Tamar to Ammon's house to care for him. She comes to the house and she cooks for him, but then he refuses to eat. Red flag. Then he sends everyone out of his house, everyone out of the room except for Tamar. He asked Tamar to bring the food that she had prepared for him into his bedroom so that she can feed it to him. And she obliges. She does this. She does what is asked of her. Once they are in the room alone, again, he sent all the people out. Absalom rapes Tamar. She asked him not to. She even tells him that if he were to speak to the king, she's sure that the king would allow him to have her as his wife and all these things. But he doesn't care. He goes ahead and he takes her anyway. And let's see what the text tells us happens after this. So let's look at chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. Howbeit, he would not hearken unto her voice. So this is saying that Amnon would not listen to Tamar when she was talking to him like, hey, you don't have to do this. She was also telling him like, this is a cowardly thing. You're going to be known as a coward throughout the nation. She was trying to, make sure that he still had a good name about himself and all those things. But verse 14, howbeit he would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than her, forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, arise, be gone. And so the text here says that he hated her. His hatred for her was greater than the love that he had for her. And this passage bothers me a lot because I don't like the fact, and I'm just being transparent, I don't like the fact that he only loved her until he got what he wanted and then he hated her. But this teaches me, and it's something I share with you all as often as I can, as often as it comes up, is that people, I don't know why we believe that this can happen, but people can and do have sex with you, have sex with other people, and still hate them. So we can't assume that because someone is willing to be intimate with us in that way that they love us. We saw that with Rachel and Leah and Jacob. We saw that it said that Jacob hated Leah and he loved Rachel, but Leah was continuing to conceive. It's just something I don't know. I just feel led to throw out. Let me keep going. So after all this has happened, he puts Tamar out of the house and he locks the door behind her. And during this period of time that we're talking about, the clothes kind of were able to describe kind of a little bit about the person or their nature and different things. So widows wore certain raiment is what the Bible calls it. Kings would wear a certain raiment. Princes and princesses would wear a certain raiment. Virgins would wear a certain raiment. So David's virgin daughter would have a certain raiment that she would wear to depict that she's a virgin, that she's also the king's daughter, etc., etc. And so once this happened, he puts her out of the house, locks the door. She tears her clothes, and puts ash upon her head, kind of signifying that she was no longer a virgin, and that this process had kind of been taken from her. And so she goes to her brother's house, Absalom, and Absalom sees her and asks her if Amnon had sex with her, had been with her. And when he finds out what happens, he's upset, but he keeps it cool for the time being. And this is something else I don't like, just me being transparent. David also hears about this, but the text doesn't give us any indication that he did anything. This reminds me a lot of the Dinah and Jacob situation, where Dinah was abused by Shechem, and Jacob then was nice to the young man after that had happened. It's just very similar. And so we see here that Absalom is upset. The text tells us that he waits 2 full years to get vengeance on Amnon for what he had done to his sister. And how he does this is he invites all of his brothers to a gathering. And while they are there, he has his servants kill Amnon, and the rest of the brothers flee when they see that this is going on. And then messengers run and tell David what has happened, and Absalom flees the presence of his father and his brothers, and he goes and dwells in Geber, I think. I forget the city. But the chapter closes by telling us that after about 3 years had passed, David began to desire to be reconciled with Absalom because he had finished mourning for the death of Amnon. And so Amnon's death is also fruit of the decision that David had made. So we see that now death is beginning, and ultimately the stage is being set. We won't see that in this study, but we'll see that Sunday night. The stage is beginning to be set for the other things that the Father said, for the kingdom to be stolen from David, for David to be humiliated by his wives being slept with in public or whatever. So that will be all this is setting that up. Okay, all this is leading to that, and all this is rooted in the decision that David made in sleeping with Uriah's wife and then having him killed. All right, let's move on to chapter 14. The chapter 14 begins, and Joab is realizing that David is missing Absalom, and he arranges to have Absalom brought back into the kingdom and into his father's presence. So how he does this is he finds a woman and he sends her into the presence of the king to act like she's a widow who is stuck between her son and her family. So the situation she was telling him was that her son, she had 2 sons, and one of them had killed the other one, out in the wilderness one day. And her family was upset at the son who was still living, and they wanted vengeance. They wanted him to die as well. She was coming to the king to ask if he could assure her that if he can make it assure her that no one would touch her son, when no one would get vengeance on her son because she didn't want any more blood to be shed. David assures her that no one would touch him, and eventually, as the conversation progresses, David realizes that the woman has been sent there on assignment from Joab. So he sends to Joab and tells him to come. He tells him to go and get Absalom and bring him back into the city. But the caveat here is that Absalom, although he could come back into the city and then back to his home, he could not enter, and he still couldn't enter into David's presence. All right. So the chapter ends by telling us that Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years and still did not enter into David's presence. So he sends for Joab, trying to, kind of say, "Hey, what's going on? Why can I see dad? Can you see his dad? Talk to him, whatever." Joab is ignoring him. So Absalom sends some servants to set Joab's field on fire. They do that. Joab then comes and talks to Absalom like, "Hey, what's going on? Why you set my field on fire?" He's like, "I've been trying to get in touch with you and you were ignoring me, so I wanted to get your attention." And then he said, "Hey, I want to see my father. If I wasn't going to see him, you could have left me where I was at." So Joab goes back, talks to David, and Absalom and David get a meeting for the first time since he's killed Amnon and fled from his father's presence. Let's look at the final verse of chapter 14, verse 33. In verse 33, it says, "So Joab came to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom." Okay, so this is David and Absalom's first interaction since that point. Let's move into chapter 15. Things didn't stay all roses for long. So shortly after this, in chapter 15, we begin to see Absalom plotting for position in Israel. Some of the translations say that he was conspiring. He said he was conspiring. And so the text says that how he would do this is that he would stand outside of the city gate each day, and as people were walking by or coming to seek the presence of the king for a matter that they needed a judgment on, he would then listen. He would say, "Hey, what's going on? Can you just tell me about it before you go talk to the king?" He would listen to their case, and then he would say, "Oh man, the king doesn't even have any judges. If only I could be a judge in Israel, I could definitely help you with your situation." So this is how he was winning over the hearts of the people of Israel. And the text says that the nation fell in love with him. Okay. And so after a number of years of doing this, like he's doing this for a while, like you would think that David would have said something. Anyway, after a number of years of doing this, Absalom then asked his father to, if he could be released to go to Hebron and bring offerings to the father, and ultimately fulfill a vow that he had made while he was in hiding. David obliges, but he doesn't know that Absalom has been planning and plotting this whole time to take the nation and ultimately become king. Remember, we saw when David had done that, one of his consequences was that the kingdom was going to be taken from him and given to someone else. Okay, and we see that beginning to set up here. And David says, okay, he didn't know that Absalom was planning this whole time to overthrow him, kind of like a coup, I guess. And so he even brings in one of David's counselors, Ahithophel, to work against him, and 200 innocent soldiers. The text says they didn't even know what they were getting into. They were just following the king's son to help him accomplish, this goal. A messenger here's what's going on. The messenger comes to David and tells David what's happened, that Absalom has planned to overthrow him as king, and he's headed back eventually to the city of Jerusalem from Hebron. And David immediately determines that it's time for them to leave before Absalom gets back to the city, because if they don't, Absalom's going to completely wipe out him and also all of the people of the city. So David and his people and, all the, like those 600 men that we talked about last week, all of them got together and they left. They head out into the wilderness. But David, he leaves 10 of his concubines, according to the text. He leaves 10 of his concubines behind to kind of manage the house and keep tabs on the house and everything while he's away. Spoiler alert. No, I'm not going to tell you guys. So the king and the people with him, they head out into the wilderness to flee from Absalom and what's going on. And as they were leaving, There were some friends that were coming to David and kind of saying like, hey, we're aligned with you and everything. But David was strategically sending and leaving friends back in the city so that they can infiltrate ultimately Absalom's circle and keep David aware of what was going on and what was being planned by the leaders. Okay, so we'll look a little bit deeper on Sunday into how this plays out with Absalom and then David and then Solomon and the ending of Second Samuel. All right, so that's all I got from Midweek Study Hall. For those that are joining Bible study, if you've never been, we would love to have you. It's on Sundays at 8 p.m. on YouTube, the same YouTube channel that you're watching right now. There's also like a link down in the description if you feel led to give, or if you want to join my email list. My website is in the description box, and I'm also gonna link the previous video to this video as well in the description box, so you can have everything that you need. All right, so I'll see you guys Sunday 8 p.m. for weekly Bible study. Listen, I love you, but more importantly than that, the Father loves you. Let Him love you. Start before you're ready, and don't stop. I'll see you guys next time.